Today in the Daily Dose, the day we lost Charlie. On December 22nd, 1962, a little more than 2 years before the United States' official entry into the Vietnam War, Captain Thomas R. Messick of the 81st Transportation Company led a top-secret mission to Quy Nhon, a 1-hour easterly flight from their Pleiku Air Base in the Central Highlands. Known as Flying Bananas, a mission requiring 15 H-21 Shawnees had proved difficult to put together, since the twin-rotor helicopter required 11 hours of maintenance for every 1 hour in the air. Joining the mission was Chief Warrant Officer Charles Howard Holloway, or Charlie, who had arrived in country only a week before the mission. And while Charlie had been trained to proficiency on the single-rotor Sikorsky H-34 Choctaw, the company's newest pilot had only 2 hours of touch-and-go flight training in the more challenging Shawnee. Chosen as flight leader for the mission, Messick made sure Holloway flew with Chief Warrant Officer Dan Gressang, who was one of the most experienced pilots in the 81st. The mission teamed the 81st with the 8th Helicopter Company, with the goal of delivering 860 South Vietnamese soldiers onto 3 landing zones north of Toi Hoa, a small fishing village along the coast. After learning that pre-insertion airstrikes were off the table, due to the belief by commanding officers that such an offensive would alert the North Vietnamese to each planned insertion site, 29 Flying Bananas onboarded 12 soldiers each for a string of insertion missions guided in by Bird Dog pilots flying in front of each transport group. After Messick led the first group of Bananas to their designated landing zone, they came under intense enemy ground fire despite their unannounced arrival. As Gressang and Holloway began to bug out, a bullet struck Holloway on the right side of his forehead, and while his seat harness held his unconscious body from falling forward onto the controls, the dead weight of his feet upon the pedals forced Gressang to fight for control of the aircraft. After the crew chief removed Holloway's feet from the pedals, the rookie pilot died in a medevac Huey bound for an army hospital in Nha Trang. A father of 5, 31-year-old Charlie Holloway would be the 4th Army aviator killed during the largely secret and underreported lead-up to the Vietnam War, awakening in members of the 81st, in Messick's own words, that we had not fully realized that we were no longer training for war, but were now in a war. On July 4, 1963, Airbase Pleiku, headquarters of the 52nd Aviation Battalion, was renamed Holloway Field, while the surrounding base was later renamed Camp Holloway, making the mission to Toi Hoa an early wake-up call for American fighting men in Southeast Asia. Today in the Daily Dose, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. After a decades-long civil war between Communist North Vietnam and the U.S.-backed puppet government of the South, led by dictator Ngo Dinh Diem, by 1964, during the height of America's Cold War against Russian-backed communist expansion, the United States engaged in bombing campaigns along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, intended to disrupt North Vietnamese troop and supply movements into the South. Spearheaded by Lieutenant General William Westmoreland, leader of the U.S. Military Assistance Command, bombardments of Laos and Vietnam were conducted by U.S. warships stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin, which were purportedly fired upon by North Vietnamese fast attack torpedo boats on August 2nd and August 4th respectively, first against the USS Maddox, followed by a second purported and now debunked attack on the USS Turner Joy. In response, on August the 7th, the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Lyndon Baines Johnson full authority, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, for the use of conventional military force in Southeast Asia to assist any member or protocol state of the Southeast Asian Collective Defense Treaty. The resolution was further ratified by the U.S. Senate, including 2 opposing votes by Oregon Senator Wayne Morse and Arkansas Senator Ernest Gruening. the later objecting to, in his words, sending our American boys into combat in a war in which we have no business. Even before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was signed into law, President Johnson took to the airways on August 5th, informing the American public about the alleged attacks on American naval assets in the Gulf of Tonkin, announcing his intention to retaliate for the unprovoked attacks, effectively kicking off the decades-long Vietnam War, which would lead to the deaths of 58,220 Americans, 200,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, as well as 1.2 million civilian casualties. The Vietnam War escalated substantially on February 13, 1965, when the U.S. military launched Operation Rolling Thunder, which was a large-scale bombing campaign of North Vietnamese targets that would persist for the next 2 years. 10 years later, the war would come to a close during the North Vietnamese Spring Offensive of 1975, leading to the fall of Saigon and America's unceremonious exit from Southeast Asia, making the Gulf of Tonkin resolution an incendiary event in 20th century history. The Battle of Long Tan. Establishing a base of operations near the South Vietnamese village of Nui Dat between April and June of 1966, the 1st Australian Task Force, or 1ATF, moved all the inhabitants of Long Pharoc and Long Hay into resettlement camps well away from their base, establishing a free fire zone for the protection of locals and Australian military personnel alike. By mid-August of that same year, Australian intelligence confirmed that the Viet Cong, or VC 275th Regiment, and the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN D445th Battalion, had taken up positions north of Long Tan, closing to within a mile of Nui Dat on August 17th, before opening fire on the Australians' base with conventional artillery and mortar fire. While the enemy's position remained outside the range of 1ATF artillery positions at Nui Dat, a second advanced artillery unit quickly silenced the enemy's fire. On the morning of August 18th, a patrol was sent out to locate enemy firing positions and to establish the direction of the VC's retreat, eventually locating weapons pits and mortar positions before coming under fire by an unexpectedly robust VC fighting force. Quickly assessing the enemy's numerical advantage, combat leaders called in artillery support, enduring heavy fighting as the VC attempted to decimate the now surrounded men of the Royal Australian Regiment D Company. Fighting not only an overwhelming enemy force, but darkness, rain, and mud, the desperate men of 1ATF eventually received a resupply drop by 2 UH-1B Iroquois from the 9th Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, followed by ground reinforcements from Nui Dat later that night, which pushed the VC into an all-out retreat. By sunrise the next day, Australian forces had pulled back to establish a defensive perimeter at Long Tan, evacuating casualties as they assessed their unexpected survival. Australian losses stood at 18 killed in action, with an additional 24 wounded, while post-war VC and PAVN sources point to 50 killed in action for the North Vietnamese, with another 100 wounded. While 1ATF initially considered the Battle of Long Tan a resounding defeat for Australian forces, the action was later deemed a strategic victory, since the battle managed to repel the VC's planned assault on Nui Dat, making the Battle of Long Tan yet another harrowing event during the bloody years of the Vietnam War. The Battle of Khe Sanh. Positioned 14 miles south of the demilitarized zone in northwestern Quang Tri Province and 6 miles from the Laotian border, the U.S. Marine base at Khe Sanh had been set up as a staging point for future planned operations against the North Vietnamese Army's resupply route along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Khe Sanh Combat Base, known as KSCB, was defended by 2 regiments of the U.S. Marine Corps, elements of the U.S. Army and Air Force, as well as a small contingent from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN. The battle broke out on January 21, 1968, when the 3rd Battalion 26th Marines came under fire from a North Vietnamese battalion positioned atop 2 hills northwest of the base. A day later, North Vietnamese forces captured the nearby village of Khe Sanh, while Viet Cong artillery positions began a long-range bombardment campaign of the base itself, hitting the main ammunition depot, which exploded some 1,500 tons of munitions with devastating consequence. Pinned down in their trenches and bunkers, the Americans at Khe Sanh endured a 66-day siege that tested the mettle of every man involved. Unwilling to risk the usual air resupply that had existed before the North's offensive, during the siege of Khe Sanh, U.S. planes dropped 100,000 tons of bombs on suspected North Vietnamese positions, while U.S. ground forces fired 158,000 artillery rounds in defense of the beleaguered base. In March that same year, an overland relief expedition known as Operation Pegasus was launched by a combined Marine Army ARVN task force, which saw success in early April when the 1st Cavalry Air Mobile and a South Vietnamese battalion pressed in on the base from the east and south, while the Marines pushed westward with an objective of reopening Highway 9, which intersected the Ho Chi Minh Trail at the Dak Rom Bridge. The siege of Khe Sanh was finally broken on April 6, 1968, after U.S. cavalrymen joined up with the 9th Marines south of Khe Sanh Air Base, while a week later, the 3rd Battalion 26 Marines scattered North Vietnamese positions atop Hill 881 North. American commanders considered the defense of Khe Sanh an enormous success, prompting Commanding General William Westmoreland to contend that if the base had fallen, the North Vietnamese may well have outflanked other vital Marine positions along the demilitarized zone. Shortly after the siege was lifted, the decision was made to dismantle the base, rather than risk additional battles in the future. By the time the last fighting ended around nearby Hill 689, 274 Americans had been killed in action, while an additional 2,541 were wounded. Losses for the North Vietnamese Army remain unknown due to the widespread practice by U.S. military leaders at the time to over-exaggerate North Vietnamese casualties. But a secret Joint Service Command report by the U.S. Defense Department's MACV later estimated a North Vietnamese death toll of 5,550 soldiers, making the Battle of Khe Sanh one of the bloodiest, protracted engagements during American involvement in the Vietnam War. Today on the Daily Dose, the raid on Son Tai. After U.S. military intelligence assessed a high likelihood that 55 American prisoners of war were being held at Son Tai prison camp near the North Vietnamese capital of Hanoi, 6 in need of immediate medical attention, President Richard M. Nixon asked Pentagon war leaders to explore some unconventional rescue ideas to bring our boys home. The result was a joint service mission codenamed Operation Ivory Coast, combining more than 100 aircraft, an immense group of support personnel, and 56 hand-picked Army Special Forces troops, who soon gained the nickname the Son Tai Raiders. Training at Eglin Air Force Base using a full mock-up of the Son Tai prison camp, during the early morning hours of November 20th, 1970, 6 helicopters, 2 large support aircraft, and 5 small attack planes took off from Thailand, while naval carrier-based fighters laid down diversionary fire over Haiphong. Flying at treetop altitudes, the airborne attack force reached Son Tai at 2:18 a.m., dropping flares to light up the camp before a lone helicopter destroyed guard towers and troop barracks in rapid succession. a second helicopter performed a pre-planned controlled crash inside the compound, mowing down trees with its blades before Green Berets piled out to rescue prisoners from their cells. A third helicopter landed outside the compound, delivering more Green Berets to the fight. Yet after the prison guards were either killed or scattered into the night, the Green Berets radioed the words "negative items," forcing a stunned bug-out of all assets from the failed mission. One F-105 Wild Weasel fighter jet was struck by a surface-to-air missile, and after the crew ejected over Laos, the returning helicopters quickly rescued them. By the time the 27-minute raid at Son Tai was over, the raiders suffered one broken ankle and a second minor injury, at the same time writing the playbook for all future raids during and following the Vietnam War. Despite the raid's failure to return POWs to American soil, the raid at Son Tai triggered North Vietnamese war leaders to consolidate American POWs into fewer locations to defend against future raids, leading to a logarithmic increase in POW communication and organization and an abrupt uptick in POW morale. One POW recalled years later that the Son Tai rescue attempt dispelled all doubt. We were not forgotten. Our country cared. The raid also defined a new model for future joint forces operations that continue to exist to this day, making the raid on Son Tai one of the most fruitful misadventures in American military. Today on the Daily Dose, the Easter Offensive. After the North Vietnamese Tet Offensive of 1968, which took American and South Vietnamese forces by complete surprise, by late 1971, U.S. Commander General Crichton Abrams and other top military leaders believed another offensive by the Communist North was in the planning stage, if for no better reason than to strengthen their bargaining power at the ongoing Paris Peace Accords. From a timing standpoint, Crichton believed the North Vietnamese would launch another Tet-style offensive on or near the January 31st celebration, but instead, the enemy attacked with unexpected ferocity in what became known as the Easter Offensive. Beginning on March 30th and ending on October 22nd, 1972, the Easter Offensive began when North Vietnamese forces engaged in a simultaneous three-front invasion of South Vietnam, characterized by conventional infantry armor assaults backed by heavy artillery. Employing some 200 to 300,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, an invasion force not seen since the Korean War, when some 300,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River into communist-backed North Korea. Conceived by North Vietnamese military planners, the 1st Corps Tactical Zone soon overran South Vietnamese defensive positions in a month-long battle that saw the city of Quang Tri fall to Northern forces, before moving south toward the city of Hue. At the same time, the North Vietnamese 2nd Corps Tactical Zone advanced toward Con Tom City in an attempt to split South Vietnam in two, while the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone saw North Vietnamese forces take Loc Ninh before advancing on the capital of Binh Long Province at An Lac. As the offensive unfolded, April proved to be a month of advances for the North, while May witnessed a period of defensive equilibrium and resupply for the North's newly captured territories. June and July, likewise, saw a period of counterattacks by American and South Vietnamese forces, leading to the September recapture of Quang Tri. And although early North Vietnamese successes were deemed impressive, the North Vietnamese experienced high casualty rates due to inept tactics and the increasing application of U.S. and South Vietnamese air power, culminating in Operation Linebacker, which was the first sustained bombing of North Vietnam since November of 1968, making the Easter Offensive of 1972 one of the deadliest events in the Vietnam. Operation Baby Lift. when the central Vietnamese city of Da Nang fell to the Viet Cong in March of 1975, the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, was slowly collapsing under near constant shelling from the approaching communist forces. In response, U.S. President Gerald Ford announced that the U.S. government would begin evacuating orphans from Saigon on a series of 30 planned flights aboard military cargo aircraft operated by the 62nd Airlift Wing of the United States Air Force. Child services organizations joined forces with the U.S. military to airlift more than 3,300 babies out of Vietnam, delivering orphans into the waiting arms of couples in the West, at the same time cementing the record for the largest act of adoption in known human history. For a divided nation mired in persistent tragedy, baby lift proved to be more of the same for Vietnam. When the first C-5A cargo plane left Tan Son Nhut Airport shortly after 4 p.m. on April 4, 1975, 12 minutes into the flight, there was an explosion that tore the lower rear fuselage apart, causing the loading ramp door to open and separate. A rapid decompression followed, along with trim, rudder, and elevator cable separation, which turned the doomed plane into a flying brick. Spilling altitude as they turned back for Tan Son Nhut, when the pilots realized they wouldn't make the runway, they applied full power to bring the nose up, belly landing in a rice paddy before skidding a quarter mile, bouncing airborne again for an additional half mile before crashing into a dike. Of the 300 people on board, 138 were killed in the crash, including 78 babies and 35 American military personnel. When American businessman Robert McCauley learned that it would take more than a week to evacuate the remaining orphans due to the lack of military transport planes, he chartered a Boeing 747 from World Airways and arranged for 300 more orphans to leave the country, paying for the trip by mortgaging his home. Operation Baby Lift flights would continue until artillery attacks by Viet Cong military units closing in on Tan Son Nhut Airport made additional flights impossible. By the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, Operation Baby Lift, along with Operation New Life, witnessed the successful evacuation of over 110,000 at-risk refugees from South Vietnam. Today on the Daily Dose, the fall of Saigon. On Tuesday, April 29, 1975, the usually crowded streets of Saigon were empty except for military personnel and ambulances. The attack by North Vietnamese forces at Tan Son Nhut Airport the day before has left the city in a 24-hour lockdown. With communist forces pressing in on downtown Saigon, the order to evacuate American nationals and South Vietnamese sympathizers was given. The original plan was to bus the evacuees to Tan Son Nhut Airport until it too came under fire by the communist building offensive. Journalists filming the air attacks witnessed a North Vietnamese helicopter go down by the presidential palace. At least 10 people died in the crash. American Ambassador Graham Martin took personal control of the situation. Amidst tremendous confusion and a total breakdown in military protocol, a steady procession of helicopters began landing within the relative safety of the walled American Embassy compound. Frightened civilians were airlifted to the American aircraft carriers Hancock and Midway, waiting some 40 miles offshore, ferried by a dedicated task force of some 80 American helicopters. Many of the surviving evacuees recalled that the most unnerving part was waiting for a ride to safety, all the while hearing artillery fire in the near distance, which only amplified their fears that the airlift would suddenly come to an end should the communists overtake the city. Besides the 80 American helicopters shuttling people to safety, South Vietnamese helicopter pilots flew their families to safety aboard the carriers as well, but lacking the space on the flight decks to stow their aircraft, the pilots were forced to ditch in the ocean or have their ships pushed into the sea. In all, approximately 7,000 people, most of them Vietnamese, were airlifted to safety during the 12-hour operation known as Frequent Wind. Desperate Vietnamese who failed to make the cut stayed at the embassy gates well into the night, desperately appealing for a Hail Mary last-minute evacuation. But for them, there was to be no mercy from the impending communist takeover. As the last of the Marines took to the rooftop of the embassy in hopes of their own Hail Mary evacuation, North Vietnamese tanks and troop carriers rolled into the city. The last of the Marines were finally airlifted from the rooftop, just as the communists stormed the compound gate. And there you have it, the fall of Saigon, today on the Daily Dose.